Hey guys, tonight we're going way back to the shores of ancient Greece, to a world where philosophers shaped empires with ideas instead of armies. It's 360 BCE, the sun is setting over the Athenian Acropolis, and you're sitting in the cool marble glow of a symposium, a gathering where men drink wine and argue about truth, virtue and the cosmos. Plato, student of Socrates, leans forward and begins to speak, not of logic or geometry tonight, but of something stranger, something that sounds like rumor or dream. He tells of a mighty island, far beyond the known world, a place of immense power and beauty that rose in arrogance against the gods and was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. You can almost hear the room quiet as he speaks the name, Atlantis. It's one of those stories that lands like a stone in the human imagination. Everyone listening knows that Plato doesn't invent myths lightly. He uses them as moral mirrors, and yet, there's something in his tone that feels less like invention and more like memory. You can feel a faint chill as he describes the glittering capital with its concentric canals, its golden temples, its armies marching across the known world. Then comes the punishment, the trembling earth, the roaring sea, the light snuffed out beneath waves. In a single day and night of misfortune, he says, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. You probably won't survive this story either. Not because the sea's coming for you, but because the idea of Atlantis has been sinking and resurfacing for over 2,000 years, and every time it drags something new to the surface. Greed, wonder, hope, guilt. If you've ever stared at the ocean and thought something's down there, you're part of that same legacy. Before we dive, pun intended, into this mystery, hit that subscribe button if you love stories that make the ancient world feel alive, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Because tonight we're crossing not just oceans but centuries. Now close your eyes for a second and imagine it. A city that defied the gods, a civilization so advanced it became legend, and an ocean that buried its name. You start where all legends start, with the teller. Plato wasn't a novelist or a mystic. He was a philosopher, which makes his decision to record the Atlantis story all the stranger. He claims he didn't invent it at all. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he says he heard it from his teacher Socrates, who heard it from an old Athenian statesman named Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests during his travels centuries before. So yes, by the time Plato writes it down, it's already a third-hand story. But that's what makes it intriguing. It feels like history that's just slipped past the edges of record. According to Plato, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. It was a vast island empire, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, ruled by powerful kings descended from Poseidon, god of the sea. They built a glorious city of concentric rings, alternating circles of land and water, with bridges, harbors, temples, and palaces, gleaming with orichalcum, a mysterious metal said to shine like fire. Atlantis, Plato says, was the very definition of abundance. Its people mastered irrigation, architecture, navigation. They controlled great fleets and conquered lands as far as Egypt. For a while, their kings were noble and wise. But power has a way of rotting the core. In time, the Atlanteans grew arrogant. They turned away from virtue and used their wealth to dominate, not to serve. When they raised their armies against Athens, yes, Athens, the gods decided the time had come to remind mortals humility. Then, disaster. The earth shook, the seas rose. In one night, Atlantis vanished. It's the perfect myth, isn't it? It has everything: hubris, divine retribution, and an ending so absolute that no evidence remains. If Plato wanted to teach a moral lesson about virtue, he couldn't have chosen a better symbol. But here's the twist. He never calls it a myth. He writes as if it were fact. He gives it dates, 9,000 years before Solon. He describes the landscape, the crops, the architecture. He writes like a geographer, not a poet. So, what was Plato doing? Did he intend the story as allegory, a parable about moral decay? Or was he passing down an ancient memory of a real event, garbled by time but rooted in truth? That's the debate that's kept scholars, mystics and conspiracy theorists busy ever since. In ancient Greece, reactions were divided. Some believed Plato's tale was a symbolic mirror of Athens itself, a warning against pride after victory in war. Others, like Aristotle, dismissed it outright. When asked about Atlantis, Aristotle reportedly shrugged, He who invented it, destroyed it, harsh, but efficient. Still, something about the story refused to die. You can imagine how it must have haunted the imagination of sailors and scholars. A vast, sunken island west of Gibraltar, a kingdom lost to the sea. Every storm, every strange current, every whisper from beyond the horizon could be traced to Atlantis. Plato had planted an idea that would outlive him by millennia, that history itself might have amnesia, that maybe, before Greece, before Egypt, there had been another civilization, greater, older, drowned. Even today, that idea carries a strange pulse. It's the reason explorers still dive into the Azores, scan the ocean floor near Santorini, and study ancient flood myths from Mesopotamia to the Andes. They're not just chasing Atlantis, they're chasing the possibility that memory can survive the sea. And as you drift back from this ancient Athenian symposium, the echo of Plato's voice fades into surf and wind. The firelight flickers across his face. Remember, he says softly, that all great nations, when they grow proud, are destroyed. The wine cups are empty. The stars are coming out over Athens. The waves crash somewhere far away beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And in the quiet between them, the story of Atlantis begins to sink again, waiting like the island itself to rise when someone dares to dream it back to life. You can almost picture the scene. Plato sitting by the glow of an oil lamp, quill in hand, dipping into ink that smells faintly of olive smoke and salt air. He's working on his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, two works that on the surface are about the structure of the cosmos, the creation of the soul, and the ideal state. And yet, hidden within these philosophical debates, he plants a story that feels startlingly out of place. A lost empire, a vanished continent, a flood that swallows everything. Why here, in a work about reason and order, does Plato suddenly sound like a prophet of doom? Because to him, Atlantis isn't fantasy, it's philosophy wearing myth's clothing. In Timaeus, Plato first introduces Atlantis almost casually. He frames it as a historical account told by Solon, the legendary Athenian lawgiver, who supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests at the temple of Neith in the city of Sais. They told him that Athens was far older than the Greeks believed, and that it had once fought a mighty enemy from beyond the ocean, a great island empire that grew too proud and was destroyed. The priest's words were meant to humble Solon, to remind him that Greece was not the first civilization to rise and fall. Then, in Critias, Plato dives into detail. The kind of detail that makes readers centuries later wonder if he knew something others had forgotten. He describes a vast island, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, rich in metals and blessed with fertile plains and mountains that formed a natural fortress. He even gives dimension-specific measurements for harbors, walls and canals. Atlantis, he says, had 10 kings, all descendants of Poseidon, who had divided the land among themselves, but ruled together under divine law. At the island's center was a shining capital built in perfect circles of land and sea, its temples sheathed in silver and gold. It's a place of impossible beauty, a paradise that sounds more like a blueprint than a legend. And yet, as always in Plato's writing, paradise comes with a warning. In the beginning, the Atlanteans are virtuous. They live by the principles of justice and moderation. They build magnificent cities, irrigate their lands, and govern with wisdom. But over time, the divine blood in them becomes diluted. They grow greedy, craving wealth and power. They turn their fleets into tools of conquest, their temples into trophies of pride. They begin to believe they are equal to the gods. Sound familiar? It should. To Plato, Atlantis is not about geography. It's about the human condition. It's a mirror of what happens when societies forget humility. And then, just when arrogance reaches its peak, comes the punishment. Then came one grievous day and night, Plato writes. There came mighty earthquakes and floods, and in a single dreadful day and night the island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea, and its people were swallowed up. The gods do not rage, they simply correct. Atlantis is erased as if it never existed. It's a perfect parable, too perfect, some say, to be true. Even in Plato's time, people were already arguing about his intentions. Was he describing a real event, passed down from Egyptian archives? Or was this simply a moral allegory, a story designed to make Athenians examine their own pride after their wars and wealth? Remember, Plato wrote these dialogues after Athens had fallen from its golden age. His teacher, Socrates, had been executed by the same city that once championed philosophy. Athens, in its hubris, had destroyed itself. Atlantis, in that light, wasn't just a story, it was a warning. Still, Plato's presentation of the tale is remarkably detailed for a parable. He gives dates, saying the events happened 9,000 years before Solon. He describes specific mountain ranges, animals, and architectural features. He names the ruling house of Atlas, the first king, from whom the island takes its name. Even the capital's dimensions, 3 rings of land, separated by moats of water, sound like a surveyor's notes. Why so much precision for a moral metaphor? That question is what kept the idea alive, long after Plato's death. If Atlantis was a symbol, why describe it like a city you could visit? Why locate it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a real place in geography? Why insist that it was a story strange yet entirely true? Maybe Plato wanted both, a myth grounded in geography, a moral dressed as memory. It's possible he used an older legend, one already known in Egypt or among sailors, and wove it into philosophy. Maybe he was reaching for something deeper than allegory, some faint echo of an ancient catastrophe remembered through generations of storytelling. After all, civilizations had fallen before. The Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, all had risen to dazzling heights and then collapsed, often because of earthquakes, eruptions or floods. To an ancient philosopher, trying to make sense of history, Atlantis could have seemed like the perfect symbol for that eternal cycle: creation, corruption, destruction. And perhaps that's why the story feels so strangely modern. It's not about gods punishing mortals for sin, it's about nature reminding humanity of its limits. It's about the idea that progress, if unchecked by virtue, leads to ruin. You could replace Atlantis with Rome, or with any empire since. The lesson doesn't age. But for all his moral intent, Plato might never have guessed that his useful fiction would one day eclipse his philosophy. The legend of Atlantis would take on a life of its own, morphing, mutating, resurfacing every time humanity looked to the horizon and wondered what was hidden beneath the sea. For now, though, in the dim light of Plato's study, it is just words on a scroll. The ink dries, the wind rattles the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, waves crash against the Greek coast, a faint eternal whisper, reminding the philosopher that all worlds, even imagined ones, can drown. You can't really understand Atlantis without understanding the world that dreamed it up. Greece in the 4th century BCE was a civilization obsessed with balance between gods and men, mind and body, logic and myth. The Greeks didn't see storytelling as fantasy, they saw it as philosophy made visible. A myth wasn't a lie, it was a lens, and through that lens, they explored truth. So when Plato introduced Atlantis, it wasn't dropped into a vacuum. It entered a culture already rich with tales of lost golden ages, of cities punished by the gods for pride. The Greeks had plenty of these: the story of Lycaon, who angered Zeus and was turned into a wolf, the flood of Deucalion, a Greek version of Noah's story, and the doomed city of Troy, destroyed by its own arrogance. Atlantis fit perfectly into that pattern, another reminder that even the greatest societies could sink beneath the weight of their own hubris. To the Greeks, stories like this weren't just bedtime entertainment, they were moral machinery. They explained earthquakes, floods, plagues, anything that reminded humans how small they were under heaven. But Plato's Atlantis stood apart because it wasn't about gods throwing tantrums or heroes defying fate. It was about something scarier: civilization itself failing. Imagine hearing it then, not as a modern listener, looking for aliens or sunken treasure, but as a Greek citizen sitting in the echoing stone colonnade of the Academy. You'd have just lived through the collapse of Athens' glory, the loss of empire, the trial and death of Socrates, the idea that a mighty, beautiful nation could vanish overnight. That hit close to home. Atlantis wasn't just myth, it was reflection. Plato's students would have recognized the parallels immediately. Atlantis, like Athens, was brilliant, rich, self-assured. It had technology, armies, art, everything that made a civilization feel immortal. And yet, it forgot humility. The Atlanteans believed their prosperity proved divine favor. When they turned to conquest, the gods didn't need to strike them down in anger. They simply let them destroy themselves. The earthquake and flood were the natural conclusion of moral collapse. In that sense, Atlantis is more sermon than story. It's Plato warning Athens, look what happens when wisdom becomes arrogance. But not everyone read it that way. Even in ancient Greece there were those who took the account literally. The historian Crantor, writing a century later, claimed he had seen inscriptions in Egypt, describing the same events, a convenient but unverifiable claim. Others, fascinated by geography, wondered if Plato had accidentally preserved a real memory of some ancient catastrophe. To them, the key lay in his precision. The Greeks didn't usually give maps and measurements for their myths. Yet Plato gives Atlantis an exact location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the gateway now known as Gibraltar. He describes its mountains, its fertile plains, its canal system, even the metals he lists, gold, copper, and the mysterious orichalcum, feel oddly specific. No wonder later generations began to ask, what if it wasn't just allegory? Greek sailors, already pushing into the Atlantic, whispered about islands in the Western Sea. They spoke of lands where strange metals gleamed and temples stood, half sunken. They didn't call them Atlantis yet, but the image had begun to grow, half philosophy, half map. And that's how the story of Atlantis began its double life. For philosophers it remained moral allegory, a tool to discuss the dangers of greed and pride. For explorers and storytellers it became something else, a lost world, waiting to be found. Over time, the two ideas blended. By the Hellenistic era, writers like Strabo and Posidonius were speculating about real sunken lands beyond the known seas. Some even link the myth to volcanic islands, suggesting that Atlantis might have been destroyed by a natural disaster. These weren't fringe theories, they were early attempts to make sense of geological phenomena that no one yet understood. And really, can you blame them? The ancient world was full of reminders that the earth could rise and fall without warning. The island of Thera, modern Santorini, had erupted centuries before Plato, destroying part of the Minoan civilization. The people who lived around the Aegean had seen the sea behave like a living thing, swallowing harbors, spitting up ash, shaking temples to rubble. To them, a story of a city devoured by the ocean wasn't fantasy, it was history that could happen again. Still, there were skeptics. Aristotle, ever the empiricist, famously dismissed the entire tale, saying, "He who invented it also destroyed it." To him, Atlantis was too neat, too moral, too convenient to be true. But the seed was already planted. For a while the legend went quiet. Philosophers studied Plato's ideas but rarely mentioned Atlantis. The Roman historians had little interest in it, preferring concrete conquests to imaginary ones. Yet the story survived, tucked inside Plato's dialogues, waiting for someone new to reopen it. And that's the strange thing about myths. They don't die, they wait. They linger in the corners of libraries, in the memories of sailors, in the questions whispered by anyone who's ever looked at the horizon and wondered if something once stood there. By the time Europe rediscovered Plato during the Renaissance, the world had changed. Ships were crossing oceans, new continents were being charted, and people were seeing lands that hadn't existed on any map. It was the perfect moment for Atlantis to rise again, this time not as moral philosophy, but as mystery. But before we sail west with those explorers, it's worth pausing to remember where the legend began. Not in the sea, but in a mind. Plato wasn't describing a lost continent, he was describing a lost virtue. He wasn't warning us about earthquakes, he was warning us about ourselves. And yet, 2,000 years later we're still scanning the ocean floor, still dreaming of an island that never stopped sinking. Because deep down we don't really want Atlantis to be a warning. We want it to be a promise that somewhere, buried under the waves, the best of what we once were might still be waiting to be found. So Plato leaves us with a single clue, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. For his audience, that phrase was electric. The pillars marked the western edge of the known world, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, a narrow throat of water separating Europe from Africa. Beyond it stretched something few Greeks dared to imagine, the Atlantic Ocean, a vast, dangerous expanse they called simply Oceanus, the endless world sea. Sailors said the air grew heavy there, that compasses spun wild, that monsters waited under grey waves. To speak of lands lying past those pillars was to step out of myth and into mystery. But if you were an ancient navigator, you might have thought otherwise. Even by Plato's time, Phoenician traders had sailed along the Atlantic coast of Africa and Spain. They spoke of islands, lush, volcanic, wreathed in mist, beyond the horizon. Some modern historians think Plato may have heard those tales and folded them into his myth. The Azores, the Canary Islands, or Madeira could easily have been the islands beyond. To a Greek mind, unaccustomed to the Atlantic scale, such places might have seemed like a vanished continent. Atlantis, then, may have begun as geography misheard. But geography alone doesn't explain why the story endures. There's something deeper about the image of a land that once was, and is no more. Maybe it taps into humanity's oldest anxiety, that everything we build, even the greatest empire, is one wave away from erasure. The Greeks, living in a landscape that trembled regularly with quakes and volcanoes, knew that fear intimately. Picture it. You're standing on the cliffs of Santorini, looking down into the sunken caldera where fire and water once collided. The island itself is a crescent, the remnant of a volcano so massive that its eruption around 1600 BCE obliterated much of the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. The explosion would have caused tidal waves, hundreds of feet high, sending shock waves across the Aegean. The sky would have darkened for months. To anyone living then, it would have looked like divine retribution. And here's the intriguing part. That disaster happened, roughly 1,000 years before Plato's birth. Could the memory of Thera's eruption have survived in fragments, myths, songs, whispers, and reached Plato's ears as the tale of Atlantis? It's possible. Oral tradition can carry memories far longer than written record. Archaeologists now know that many flood myths, whether Greek, Mesopotamian, or biblical, may be rooted in real geological events, rising sea levels, sudden tsunamis, even collapsing river deltas. For a culture that saw the gods' will in every natural force, a cataclysmic eruption could easily become a story of divine punishment. Still, Plato doesn't mention Thera or Crete by name. His Atlantis lies far to the west, not the Aegean. That detail matters, because for the Greeks, west meant the unknown, the direction of the setting sun, of death, of mystery. The Atlantic wasn't just another sea, it was a frontier between worlds. To set Atlantis there was to put it on the edge of existence itself. For centuries after Plato, that vague direction beyond the pillars became both invitation and curse. Explorers stared westward and wondered. Ancient geographers tried to map it. Some placed Atlantis near Spain's coast, others in the shallows of North Africa. A few even thought the entire Atlantic Ocean was once dry land before being flooded. A poetic attempt to explain how such a mighty island could vanish. By the Hellenistic period, scholars like Diodorus Siculus were suggesting that Atlantean myths were echoes of real islands near Africa. The Carthaginians supposedly guarded secret routes to those western lands, keeping them hidden from rivals. That rumor alone was enough to keep the legend alive for generations. Even as philosophy moved on, Atlantis became a kind of shorthand in Greek culture, a metaphor for the unreachable. Poets compared banished loves to Atlantis. Philosophers used it as the symbol for lost wisdom. The island's destruction wasn't seen as tragedy, so much as inevitability. Everything perfect, Plato had implied, must fall. And yet curiosity has its own gravity. By the time of Roman explorers, people were already looking for the place on real maps. Roman geographer Pliny the Elder spoke of islands that might be remnants of Atlantis. Others thought the Atlantic Ocean itself got its name from the lost kingdom of Atlas, its first king. Slowly, the myth and the map began to merge. Imagine the appeal. To a sailor or philosopher, Atlantis wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was a promise that the world still held secrets. Beyond the sunset, beyond the known waters, there might still lie something magnificent waiting to be rediscovered. For a civilization like Greece, whose myths were always about longing, about journeys and returns, Atlantis was the ultimate destination. And maybe that's why the myth never sank completely. It embodied a paradox that still defines us. The urge to believe that knowledge is both lost and recoverable. Atlantis isn't just about what perished. It's about what might still survive under the surface. Every generation since has looked westward with the same combination of fear and fascination. The unknown sea became the canvas for dreams of paradise, and for the dread that paradise always ends. Because somewhere out there, beneath that endless grey horizon, lies the ghost of a city that once dared to rival the gods. And even if it never existed, we've never stopped trying to find it. The waves crash against Gibraltar's rocks. The sky darkens. The last light fades from the western ocean. And you can almost hear Plato's whisper. Beyond this point, everything you know drowns. So what exactly did Plato say Atlantis looked like? Let's step inside his imagination, or perhaps his memory, and see this vanished empire the way he described it. You stand on the deck of a ship approaching an island the size of a small continent. Ahead, the air shimmers with sea spray, and rising from the horizon is something you've never seen before, a city that seems to spiral outward in circles. Water, land, water, land, the whole capital Hattel as a series of concentric rings, connected by bridges. Canals stretch between them like arteries, lined with docks where fleets of ships wait under banners of gold and blue. It's not fantasy, it's order, geometry made divine. Plato tells us the center of the city was sacred ground. There, on a hill surrounded by the innermost ring of water, stood the temple of Poseidon, the god who fathered Atlantis's first kings. Its walls were covered in silver, its roof in ivory, and its pinnacles in shining gold. Inside stood a colossal statue of the sea god, driving 6 winged horses, his eyes blazing with gems that caught the sunlight. Every 10 years the 10 kings of Atlantis would gather here to swear oaths and offer sacrifice. Bulls were led to the temple, their blood poured into the ground as a pledge of unity and obedience to divine law. It sounds extravagant, but in Greek terms this wasn't absurd. It was ideal. The Greeks associated symmetry and splendor with moral balance. To them, beauty reflected virtue. A perfectly ordered city meant a perfectly ordered soul, so at first Atlantis is everything a philosopher could dream of: law, order, technology, abundance. It's civilization at its peak. Plato describes fertile plains laid out in perfect rectangles, irrigated by countless canals. The soil was rich enough to grow 2 harvests a year. The mountains surrounding the city glittered with precious metals. From their quarries came copper, gold and something even rarer, orichalcum, a red gold alloy that shone like fire and covered the walls of their temples. The Atlanteans built harbors so vast that 1,000 ships could anchor there at once. They had hot and cold springs, elaborate baths, and even racecourses for horses. It was, quite simply, paradise. But paradise never lasts long in Greek thought. Over time, Plato says, the divine part of the Atlanteans' nature began to weaken. The descendants of Poseidon grew more human, ambitious, greedy, selfish. They no longer valued virtue but wealth. They turned their engineering to war, their art to luxury. They began to conquer neighboring lands, pushing their empire as far as Egypt and Italy. What had once been harmony became hunger. When they set their sights on Athens, it wasn't just another invasion. It was a test of moral character. The Athenians, still pure and just in Plato's eyes, fought bravely and defeated the Atlanteans. This, he says, happened 9,000 years before his own time, when Athens itself was still young. It's the ultimate philosophical flex. Athens, the city of reason, triumphs over Atlantis, the city of pride, and then the gods intervene. The myth reaches its breaking point. One night, the skies roar with thunder, the earth shudders, mountains split, fires burst from the sea. The Atlanteans, already corrupted, find no mercy in the gods they once worshipped. The waves rise higher and higher, until the island itself begins to sink. In a single day and night of misfortune, Plato writes, the island of Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves. It's a breathtaking image. An empire swallowed whole, ships torn apart, palaces crumbling, golden temples vanishing into the dark. You can almost hear the final silence, the hiss of the sea closing over what had been the world's greatest city. Now here's where things get interesting. Plato stops there. No survivors, no relics, no map, just erasure. The story ends as abruptly as the island itself. But the level of description he gives before that destruction has puzzled scholars for centuries. If Atlantis was only an allegory, why write as if he'd seen it? Why describe its dimensions, its canals, its metallurgy, its politics? It's far too detailed for simple moral storytelling. Some researchers think Plato was drawing on older stories of powerful civilizations known to have vanished, like the Minoans on Crete, whose palaces and plumbing systems were centuries ahead of their time before the volcanic eruption of Thera destroyed them. Others think he was projecting forward, imagining an ideal society that fell to show that philosophy alone couldn't save humanity from itself. Either way, he created something that feels eerily real, because the fear it represents is real. Civilizations fall, empires drown, All it takes is pride and a little bad luck. The image of Atlantis sinking is in a way the ultimate human nightmare, that our progress, our monuments, even our history, can vanish overnight. You can feel that fear humming under every sentence Plato wrote. He's not writing fantasy, he's writing prophecy. And maybe that's why the story hit so deeply, and why it still does. Atlantis isn't just about the sea reclaiming an island. It's about time reclaiming everything. Plato likely never imagined that 2,000 years later, people would be diving into the Atlantic with sonar scanners and submarines trying to prove him right. But maybe he'd understand it. After all, he was the one who said that knowledge itself is just remembering what we've forgotten. And Atlantis, whatever it was, feels like something humanity is still trying to remember. Close your eyes for a moment. You can almost hear it. The roar of waves, the collapse of towers, the last scream of marble breaking, then silence. A few bubbles rising from the depths, and beneath them, in the cold dark, a city that once dared to touch the divine now sleeps, its streets lined with coral, and its temples coated in silence. When Plato says Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night, he isn't exaggerating for effect. To the ancient Greeks, that phrase carried a specific rhythm, the sense of something instant, irreversible, cosmically just. One moment, a world at its height. The next, the ocean swallowing everything. But that detail also gives the story a strangely geological realism. Volcanoes erupt in hours, earthquakes strike in seconds, and tsunamis erase coastlines before anyone can pray. What Plato described in moral terms, modern science would later recognize as the language of catastrophe. Imagine it. The night sky flashes white as lightning splits the clouds. The earth trembles underfoot. In the distance, the harbor tilts. Ships slide off their moorings, and water starts rushing in. Not as waves, but as walls. Temples crumble. The golden statue of Poseidon cracks and fire bursts through the sea, as if the gods themselves were ripping the world apart from below. Then the island disappears, leaving only whirlpools where a continent had been. By morning, nothing remains but foam. That image, so final, so cinematic, would become the heartbeat of the legend for the next 2,000 years. But let's step back. Was Plato describing an ancient cataclysm that actually happened, or was he giving form to a universal fear? For the Greeks, disasters were never random. When the earth shook, it was Poseidon stirring beneath the sea. When volcanoes erupted, it was the breath of the underworld breaking through. The destruction of Atlantis, then, wasn't about geology. It was about morality. The gods didn't just destroy the island, they erased its memory. Oblivion itself became punishment. Yet that idea, instant annihilation by nature, wasn't unique to Greece. Flood myths appear everywhere. The Sumerians told of a great deluge that wiped out humanity, leaving only one righteous man, Utnapishtim, to survive in a boat. The Hebrew Bible transformed that tale into the story of Noah. In India's Vedic texts, the god Vishnu warns King Manu of an oncoming flood, and guides him to safety. The Aztecs had their own version. The fourth age of the world, they said, ended in water. Across cultures, the same theme repeats: prosperity, pride, punishment, water. So maybe Atlantis wasn't one story, but a synthesis of many. Plato could have taken older flood traditions and shaped them into something new, an allegory for civilization itself. His genius wasn't inventing Atlantis, it was refining the idea of loss into a moral compass. But there's another layer. By calling the destroyer of Atlantis an earthquake and a flood, Plato introduced a paradox. Natural disaster is divine justice. It's one of philosophy's oldest dilemmas. If the gods are moral, why use immoral forces like fire and water to punish? Were the gods angry, or were they indifferent? For Plato, it didn't matter. Nature was the instrument, and the lesson was the same. When humans forget balance, balance restores itself. The destruction of Atlantis wasn't a divine tantrum. It was equilibrium reasserting its rule. That's why the story haunted later thinkers. It wasn't just the scale of destruction, it was its logic. Atlantis wasn't conquered by armies, or overthrown by rebellion. It simply ceased to be, like a moral equation balancing itself. That's what makes it so unsettling. But if Atlantis was allegory, it was also strangely prophetic. Geological records show that the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts have indeed witnessed cataclysmic floods throughout prehistory. Massive tsunamis, possibly triggered by undersea landslides or volcanic eruptions, struck these regions thousands of years before Plato. In particular, the eruption of Thera Santorini around 1600 BCE unleashed waves that devastated the Minoan ports of Crete. Archaeologists even found houses frozen in time, frescoes intact, pottery in place suddenly abandoned. Could those ruins, half buried in ash and pumice, be the fossilized echo of Atlantis? Many historians think so. The Minoans were the closest thing to Plato's description, a maritime civilization with advanced engineering, art, and trade networks stretching across the Aegean. They worshipped bulls and sea gods, just as the Atlanteans supposedly did, and their downfall came from the sea itself, a combination of earthquakes, eruptions, and tidal waves. To later Greek storytellers, catastrophe would have seemed like the god's own handwriting. If you're Plato, living centuries later, you don't need to invent Atlantis from nothing. You just need to look at the ruins of Thera, listen to sailors' tales of drowned islands, and imagine a civilization greater than them all, one that vanished overnight. Then you turn it into philosophy, and that's exactly what he did. He didn't ask his listeners to believe in Atlantis, he asked them to learn from it. The story wasn't meant to make them curious about geography, it was meant to make them ashamed of arrogance. Atlantis stood as a warning that perfection, when untempered by humility, collapses under its own weight. But, because human curiosity doesn't stop where moral lessons begin, over the centuries the warning faded, and only the mystery remained. People forgot that Plato had been talking about pride and virtue. They remembered only the island that sank. Atlantis began to drift, first through myths, then through maps, then through entire civilizations that longed for lost paradises. In that sense, the destruction of Atlantis didn't end the story, it began it. Because once you imagine that somewhere, beneath the endless ocean, lies a city built by gods and ruined by men, you can never stop looking for it. Every ripple on the water, every half-buried ruin, every unexplained ridge on the seafloor becomes a clue. The island may have sunk, but the idea floats forever. Maybe that's the real trick Plato pulled. He didn't just invent a story about a city that drowned. He invented the idea that human memory itself could drown, and that storytelling was the act of diving after it. Close your eyes, and you can still see it. Towers made of orichalcum gleaming like fire under the water, avenues of marble stretching into darkness, fish drifting through the gates of temples that once echoed with prayer. The sea has claimed it, but it hasn't erased it. Not really. Because Atlantis, whether it lived or not, is still moving in our myths, our science, our imagination. The waves may bury stone, but they can't bury wonder. After Plato, the story of Atlantis didn't disappear. It fractured. Some philosophers dismissed it outright as moral theatre. Others treated it as ancient history distorted by time. Aristotle rolled his eyes and said, "The man who invented Atlantis also destroyed it," but others weren't so sure. The world was vast, and even for the Greeks, much of it was unmapped. Somewhere beyond the Western Sea, could there really have been a lost empire swallowed by waves? The earliest skeptics in antiquity were practical thinkers. They pointed out that no Greek, Egyptian, or Phoenician record, outside Plato's dialogues, ever mentioned such an island. The Egyptians, famous for recording even the color of the Nile's floods, had no inscription of Atlantis. Historians like Herodotus, who catalogued everything from Persian kings to sacred crocodiles, made no reference to it. If a continent had sunk within living memory, surely someone would have noticed, they argued. That the believers counted. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the gods had erased every trace. Maybe the story survived only because a few Egyptian priests had preserved it secretly, until Solon carried it to Greece. That tug-of-war between faith and skepticism has followed Atlantis for 24 centuries. Even in antiquity, writers tried to rationalize the myth. Some claimed Atlantis wasn't an island at all, but a poetic description of a flood, or earthquake, in the Mediterranean. Others argued that Plato had simply renamed the Minoan civilization. A few thinkers in Alexandria even tried to link Atlantis to biblical events, suggesting it was the world before Noah's flood. For them, it wasn't myth or history, it was prehistory. Meanwhile, storytellers and poets couldn't resist the drama. The playwright Euripides wove hints of sunken lands into his tragedies. The geographer Strabo mused that Plato might have been partly true, and as Rome rose, Atlantis slipped quietly from philosophy into legend, a symbol of glory lost to excess, the perfect tale for an empire that would one day fall the same way. Then the silence began. For over 1,000 years, through the Middle Ages, almost no one spoke of Atlantis. Europe's imagination had turned inward, toward theology and faith. Stories of drowned pagan islands weren't exactly welcome in an age ruled by monasteries, but myths of long memories. The scrolls of Plato's dialogues survived in dusty libraries, waiting for rediscovery. That rediscovery came during the Renaissance, when curiosity was reborn, and old texts were copied, translated, and devoured. Suddenly, thinkers were reading Plato again. And this time, they weren't just philosophers, they were explorers. It's the 15th century. The printing press is spreading new ideas like wildfire. Maps are redrawn, and sailors whisper of lands beyond the horizon. Columbus hasn't yet sailed, but the idea of an unknown world is already stirring in European minds. When scholars stumble on Plato's account of a great island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, lost to the sea, their imaginations ignite. Atlantis fits perfectly into this age of rediscovery. It's ancient, exotic, conveniently located somewhere in the Atlantic, exactly where no one has yet explored. The ships start pushing westward. Every rumor of strange islands, every sighting of unknown shores becomes evidence. Perhaps this, they whisper, is Atlantis reborn. The legend starts to morph. It's no longer just a moral parable. It becomes a map. Writers like Francisco López de Gómara, in the 1500s, claim the newly found Americas are remnants of Atlantis. Sir Francis Bacon, in his 1627 utopian fable, The New Atlantis, imagines a society built on science and discovery. The lost island, resurrected not as punishment, but as perfection. The myth has transformed. Plato's city of pride becomes Bacon's city of progress. Meanwhile, theologians twist the story to fit their own cosmologies. To some, Atlantis was Eden's twin, the cradle of mankind wiped out by divine flood. To others, it was the world before Babel, destroyed for its arrogance. The myth's flexibility was its power. It could mean anything anyone needed it to mean. Sailors brought back tales of strange ruins on the ocean floor, coral structures mistaken for temples, volcanic islands mistaken for the peaks of a drowned land. Cartographers, eager to fill the blank spaces of the Atlantic, began drawing Isla de San Brandan, or Antilia, ghost islands inspired by half-remembered legends. Atlantis was reborn, not as a moral symbol, but as a destination. You can imagine Plato sighing somewhere in the afterlife. His philosophical allegory had become the original treasure map, but in a strange way, that shift kept the myth alive. Each new age found its own reflection in Atlantis. For the Greeks, it was a warning about arrogance. For Renaissance Europe, it was a symbol of human potential, a lost world waiting to be rediscovered by brave explorers. For theologians, it was proof of divine power. The story kept changing shape, but never lost its pulse. And as the 16th and 17th centuries rolled on, the legend began to gather evidence, or at least what people thought was evidence. Travelers described underwater ruins in the Caribbean. Volcanic islands erupted suddenly and sank again, feeding the idea that land could vanish overnight. Maps began labeling the Azores as islands of the Atlanteans. The line between history and imagination blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. By the 1700s, when Europe's Enlightenment philosophers were dissecting every old superstition, Atlantis still refused to die. Rationalists like Voltaire mocked it, but explorers still looked for it. Even scientists, armed with compasses and telescopes, admitted that the ocean floor was vast and largely unknown. Who can say, they wondered, what lies beneath the sea? Atlantis had become an intellectual mirror, reflecting whatever each generation feared or desired most. For the ancients it was punishment. For the explorers it was hope. For the skeptics it was folly. But for everyone, it was irresistible. Because deep down, even the skeptics had to admit one thing. The sea hides things. And that's enough to keep any legend alive. So by the time the first European ships crossed the Atlantic and set foot on the shores of the New World, one thought lingered behind every expedition, whispered by sailors staring west at sunset. What if Plato was right? By the time the Middle Ages gave way to the Age of Discovery, The old world was finally catching up to Plato's imagination. The oceans that had once marked the edge of the world were now highways for exploration. Maps no longer ended at the Pillars of Hercules. They began there, and for the sailors who dared to venture west, Plato's ancient words became a kind of compass, pointing towards something half remembered, half invented. When Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492, he carried more than navigational charts. He carried centuries of legends about lost lands in the Atlantic. Historians still debate how much Plato's story influenced him, but Columbus himself mentioned islands spoken of by the ancients in his letters. Some of his contemporaries even claimed he believed the Caribbean might hold remnants of Atlantis. Imagine the irony. The man who accidentally found a new world may have been looking for a vanished one. And he wasn't alone. Every explorer who crossed the Atlantic brought back stories that only deepened the mystery. The Azores, Madeira, and Canary Islands, isolated volcanic archipelagos, scattered like breadcrumbs across the mid-Atlantic, were thought by many to be the surviving peaks of Atlantis. Sailors told tales of submerged walls, glimpsed beneath clear waters, of statues or columns rising from the seafloor. These were probably reefs, rocks, or coral formations, but in an age hungry for wonder, they were proof enough. Atlantis was no longer a parable. It was a place. During the 1500s and 1600s, Europe's greatest minds began trying to fit Plato's myth into geography. The Italian scholar Francesco Patrizzi proposed that the Americas themselves were Atlantis. The philosopher Francis Bacon reimagined the island in his utopian tale, The New Atlantis, as a hidden society devoted to science and reason. For Bacon, Atlantis wasn't a lost empire, it was humanity's future, reborn through knowledge. That shift is crucial. The Renaissance and Enlightenment transformed Atlantis from a moral warning into a dream, where Plato had seen corruption and punishment. Thinkers like Bacon saw potential, the idea that somewhere, beyond the known world, lay a society wiser and more advanced than our own. Atlantis became a symbol of progress, not pride. But belief in its physical reality never truly went away. In 1627, a Jesuit priest named Athanasius Kircher published one of the first maps of Atlantis, based entirely on Plato's description. He flipped the Mediterranean and the Atlantic on the page, placing Atlantis between Europe and the Americas. It looked remarkably like a missing continent. To Kircher, this wasn't imagination, it was reconstruction. The flood had washed the island away, but its shape still haunted the ocean's depths. From there, the legend spiraled outward, absorbing every new discovery like a sponge. When explorers reached the West Indies, they found native peoples with ancient traditions of floods and sunken lands. Spanish chroniclers eagerly connected those stories to Atlantis. The Aztec myth of Aztlan, the legendary homeland from which their ancestors came, sounded close enough to Atlantis for some Europeans to decide it must be the same place. Aztlan, they said, was Atlantis reborn in the New World. Of course, these parallels were coincidences, but to Renaissance minds they were thrilling ones. Each new ruin, each mysterious carving, each unfamiliar god was a breadcrumb leading back to Plato. The Atlantic Ocean, once a symbol of terror, became a stage for rediscovering a forgotten golden age. Even the newly mapped Caribbean islands seemed to conspire in keeping the dream alive. Volcanic peaks jutted from turquoise water, cloaked in mist and dense jungle. Earthquakes and sudden eruptions were common, feeding the idea that land could rise and sink overnight. In 1692, when most of Port Royal, Jamaica collapsed into the sea after a massive quake, newspapers across Europe called it a modern Atlantis. By the 18th century, the myth had become a part of global consciousness. The Enlightenment thinkers tried to dismiss it as superstition, but even they couldn't quite resist its pull. Voltaire, ever the skeptic, joked, "If Atlantis existed, it is surely inhabited by philosophers." The scientist Buffon considered the possibility that changing sea levels had once joined continents together, creating and destroying land bridges. To him, Plato might have been poetically describing a real geological event. But there were others, more romantic than rational, who saw Atlantis as the key to humanity's lost origins. They imagined the Atlanteans as the ancestors of all civilizations, the builders of Egypt's pyramids, the inventors of writing, the teachers of the world. The French scholar Jean-Sylvain Bailly argued that the knowledge of the ancients came from a sunken Arctic continent, Others moved Atlantis to the Indian Ocean, or even under the ice of Antarctica. The farther science pushed the boundaries of the map, the more Atlantis followed, always just out of reach. The story had become like the ocean itself, vast, mutable, impossible to contain. Still, something about it rang true, not factually, but emotionally. Every era that heard the legend saw its own reflection in it. For the explorers, it was a lost world to be reclaimed. For the philosophers, it was a puzzle of morality and memory. For the poets, it was beauty undone. And beneath all of that ran the same human ache, the fear that everything we build can be undone by the earth that sustains it. You can almost see why sailors, staring at endless blue horizons, would whisper about Atlantis. The Atlantic is a strange ocean. Its waves seem heavier, its winds older. Beneath them lie mountain ranges, chasms, and plateaus deeper than Everest is tall. In the 1700s, before sonar or satellites, that unseen world must have felt infinite. And somewhere in that infinity, the ghost of Plato's island still waited. The myth had drifted far from philosophy, but its current was stronger than ever. The ocean had swallowed Atlantis, but the Renaissance and soon modern science was beginning to dredge it up again. And by the 19th century, when reason and romance collided in full force, the legend would come roaring back to life, bigger, wilder, and stranger than even Plato could have imagined. By the dawn of the 19th century, the myth of Atlantis had drifted into new waters. Science was beginning to replace scripture as the way people explained the world, but the sea still guarded its mysteries. Steamships were charting the Atlantic, deep-sea cables were being laid, and explorers were mapping coastlines that had once existed only on sailors' dreams. And amid all this progress, a question that had slept since Plato began to stir again. What if Atlantis was real after all? It started innocently enough with curiosity, not obsession. Scholars in Europe, flush with the confidence of Enlightenment reason, began treating Plato's story like a historical hypothesis. Maybe he had exaggerated, they said, but what if his description contained a kernel of truth? Geologists were discovering evidence of ancient cataclysms, fossils of sea creatures high in mountains, submerged forests off European coasts. The idea that land could rise and sink was no longer heresy. The earth, they realized, was far older and more volatile than anyone had imagined. Then came the Victorians, and they turned that flicker of curiosity into a full-blown craze. In 1882, a man named Ignatius Donnelly, a US congressman with a passion for lost worlds, published a book titled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It became an instant sensation. Donnelly argued that Plato's story was literal history, a record of a once great civilization that had perished around 9600 BCE. To him, Atlantis wasn't allegory, but archaeology waiting to be discovered. His evidence, myths, flood stories, pyramid-like structures, and similarities between ancient cultures that he believed couldn't be coincidence. Egypt, he claimed, was a colony of Atlantis. So was Mesoamerica, the Mayan pyramids, and the Egyptian ones, two alike, he said. To be independent, they had to share a common ancestor. Donnelly's logic was dubious, but his storytelling was magnetic. He described Atlantis as the mother of all civilizations, the cradle of human knowledge drowned beneath the Atlantic after a cosmic catastrophe. Perhaps a comet strike or shifting poles, his prose dripped with the drama of discovery. All that we know, all that we are, all that we have, he wrote, comes down to us from that mighty race. Victorian readers ate it up. Newspapers serialized excerpts. Scientists argued, mystics rejoiced. Atlantis fever had begun, and it came at exactly the right time. The 19th century was obsessed with progress and nostalgia all at once. Steam engines, telegraphs, and railways had transformed the world, but they had also made it smaller, faster, and stranger. The idea of a forgotten utopia beneath the waves, a civilization wiser, nobler, perhaps purer, was irresistible. It was both escape and mirror, a fantasy of what humanity once was, and a warning of what it could lose again. Donnelly's Atlantis spawned imitators everywhere. Poets wrote odes to the drowned city. Painters imagined marble colonnades glittering under blue-green depths. Novelists, like Jules Verne in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, hinted at Atlantean ruins in their tales of exploration. Even early scientists began looking for geological evidence. When oceanographers discovered the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a vast underwater mountain chain stretching from Iceland to the South Atlantic, Enthusiasts immediately pointed and shouted, "There, that's it." To them, it was proof that a continent had once existed and sunk. But Atlantis wasn't just science fiction, it was also spiritual. The late 1800s saw a surge of theosophy, mysticism, and occult movements trying to blend science and faith. Figures like Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, claimed that Atlantis was the home of a spiritually advanced race, the fourth root race of humanity, whose wisdom had seeded the world's religions. In her cosmology, Atlantis wasn't just real, it was sacred. Its destruction was part of a divine cycle, one that humanity would repeat if it failed to evolve spiritually. By then, Atlantis had slipped completely free of Plato's tether. It was no longer about moral hubris, it was about cosmic destiny. Of course, real scientists bristled. The new field of geology was mapping continental drift and proving that land didn't just vanish overnight. Archaeologists were uncovering the ruins of Troy and Pompeii, showing that myth could be rooted in history, but not in the way Donnelly imagined. The evidence for Atlantis, they argued, simply wasn't there. But logic rarely kills a good story. In the public imagination, Atlantis had become something more than truth. It was possibility. It represented everything. Science couldn't yet explain why ancient civilizations shared symbols, why lost species appeared suddenly in fossils, why the ocean felt so endlessly mysterious, and so even as skepticism grew, the legend refused to sink. By the early 20th century, Atlantis had become part of modern mythology. It appeared in pulp magazines, stage plays, radio dramas, and eventually Hollywood films. Every generation updated it to fit its anxieties. After World War I, Atlantis became a symbol of lost innocence, an empire destroyed by its own power. After World War II, it reflected fear of atomic annihilation, a reminder that even advanced civilizations can erase themselves in a day and night of hubris. And somewhere in all that noise between the scholars, mystics, and filmmakers, the ghost of Plato must have been smiling. Because whether people realized it or not, they were still wrestling with his original question: how does civilization survive its own success? Today we know more about the ocean than ever before, and yet we still haven't found Atlantis. But the 19th century left us something more lasting than any map. It turned Atlantis from philosophy into obsession, from a moral tale into a mirror that reflects whatever humanity most longs for or most fears. And that's the trick of the myth. It doesn't drown, it drifts. It reshapes itself every time someone asks, what if? Close your eyes for a moment. Picture that Victorian study, the smell of leather and candle smoke. Donnelly hunched over his desk. Stacks of Plato's dialogue spread before him. Outside, rain taps on the window like waves on a hull. He looks up, imagining an island glowing beneath the sea, its towers catching sunlight that never reaches the surface. He smiles, dips his pen, and writes another line that will make millions believe again. Because even in an age of reason, the heart still belongs to the ocean. And the ocean, as Plato warned, never gives up its secrets easily. As the 20th century unfolded, Atlantis found itself standing at a strange crossroads between science and fantasy, skepticism and longing. The myth had become so deeply rooted in popular imagination that it began to leak into academic circles, not as proof of a lost continent, but as an open question: could fragments of Plato's description match anything we now knew about Earth's past? By then, geology had matured into a serious science. Continental drift, tectonic plates, and undersea mapping were transforming how humans saw the planet. The ocean was no longer an abyss of mystery. It was a dynamic, shifting surface constantly reshaped by time. But even with this new knowledge, one unsettling truth remained. The sea still hid more than it revealed. For every map drawn, there were depths uncharted, ridges unnamed. And where mystery lingered, Atlantis always followed. Early 20th century explorers and scholars proposed dozens of locations for the lost island, each more imaginative than the last. Some placed it near the Azores, others along the coast of Spain or Morocco, or in the Caribbean near Cuba. A few even argued that Antarctica, under its thick ice, was once Atlantis before the poles shifted. The beauty of the theory, and its flaw, was that it could be made to fit almost anywhere. But the most compelling candidate, at least for a while, wasn't in the Atlantic at all. It was in the Aegean Sea. In the 1950s, Greek archaeologist Spiro Marinatas proposed a new idea, that Atlantis was actually inspired by the destruction of the Minoan civilization on Crete and Santorini, Thera, more than 1,000 years before Plato. When Thera's volcano erupted around 1600 BCE, it caused one of the largest natural disasters in human history. Entire towns were buried in ash. Tidal waves struck Crete. The once flourishing Minoan Empire collapsed. For Maronatus and his followers, the connection was obvious: an advanced maritime culture destroyed by the sea. And indeed, the ruins of ancient Akrotiri on Santorini looked eerily familiar. Multi-story houses, paved streets, indoor plumbing, even art showing ships and dolphins. It was a civilization lost and forgotten until the modern age. Sound familiar? The Minoan hypothesis became one of the first serious attempts to explain Atlantis scientifically. To many archaeologists, it made perfect sense. Plato had simply borrowed fragments of an old Mediterranean disaster and exaggerated it into moral myth. The island beyond the Pillars of Hercules might not have been literal. Perhaps he'd heard the story second-hand, its geography distorted by time and translation. But not everyone was satisfied. The Minoans were impressive. Yes, but they weren't an empire larger than Libya and Asia combined, and their island hadn't sunk completely. It still existed. For those seeking Plato's Atlantis, Santorini was too small, too near, too survivable. So the search went on. In the 1960s and 70s, advances in underwater exploration gave the myth new life. Submarines and sonar revealed vast mountain ranges and plateaus beneath the Atlantic. Proof, perhaps, that continents had indeed risen and fallen. Off the coast of the Bahamas, divers reported seeing perfectly straight lines of stone on the seafloor, which they called the Bimini Road. To believers, it was the Smoking Gun, an ancient highway built by Atlanteans. To scientists, it was natural limestone shaped by tides. But by then, reason didn't matter. The legend had gone cinematic. The Cold War even added fuel. As the US and Soviet Union raced to explore the deep sea for submarines, each side quietly collected data on the ocean floor. When rumors spread that one or both had found unexplained structures, Atlantis fever spiked again. Popular magazines featured glowing covers of underwater temples, golden domes and hieroglyphs carved into coral. And yet, as the tools grew sharper, the evidence stayed silent. No ruins, no inscriptions, no lost continent. Still, the story refused to die. It simply adapted. Writers like Charles Hapgood proposed that Earth's crust had once shifted suddenly, displacing entire continents, possibly sending Atlantis sliding beneath the sea. Others, like Edgar Cayce, the self-proclaimed sleeping prophet, claimed in trance that Atlantis had used crystal-powered technology and would one day rise again near the Bahamas. For Cayce's followers, Plato wasn't a philosopher, he was a historian of a forgotten super-civilization. These theories blurred into one another, mixing pseudo-archaeology, mysticism, and just enough science to sound plausible. It didn't matter that geologists rolled their eyes. For the public, Atlantis was irresistible because it existed at the edge of the possible, a riddle wrapped in the ocean's silence. Meanwhile, real archaeology was doing something even more extraordinary, uncovering ancient civilizations once thought impossible. The ruins of Troy were dug from a hill in Turkey. The cities of the Indus Valley, lost for millennia, re-emerged in the deserts of Pakistan. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built over 11,000 years ago, proved that advanced architecture existed long before recorded history. Each find whispered the same thing: human memory is older than we think. And that's what kept Atlantis alive, the faint, nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, Plato's story wasn't pure fiction. Maybe it was garbled history, an echo of something the Earth had erased. By the late 20th century, the legend had gone fully global. Television documentaries traced Atlantean artifacts across 5 continents. Authors wrote bestsellers claiming Atlantean survivors had seeded Egypt, the Andes, and even Stonehenge. New Age movements adopted the myth as a symbol of spiritual awakening. Atlantis became a metaphor for enlightenment, a civilization so advanced that it transcended the material world. It's a long way from Plato's moral warning about hubris, but that's the genius of the story. It shapeshifts. To the ancients, it was punishment. To Victorians, a mystery. To modern dreamers, a promise. And so, even now, sonar scans and satellites keep sweeping the ocean floor. Each new discovery, an underwater wall, a strange formation, a sunken ruin, sparks the same question whispered since 360 BCE. Is that it? Maybe the better question is why we want it to be. Because Atlantis in the end isn't about a place. It's about the ache for one, a perfect world that fell, a reflection of every civilization's secret fear that its golden age might already be over. As the modern world dug deeper into its own past, one thing became clear: Atlantis had become more than a legend. It was a mirror for humanity's oldest stories about loss, pride, and rebirth. And in that mirror you could see something remarkable. Almost every civilization on Earth had its own version of a great flood. Thousands of years before Plato, the Sumerians told of Ziusudra, a righteous man who built a massive boat to survive a divine deluge, sent to cleanse the world. The Babylonians turned that same story into the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero meets a survivor of a flood that wiped out humanity. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah sails across the endless waters under a rain of judgment. In India's Vedic texts, a god warns King Manu of a coming flood, saving him in a boat steered by a giant fish. In China, Emperor Yu the Great drains the world's floodwaters to restore order. Even in the Americas, the Maya, Aztecs, and Inca all speak of worlds destroyed by water and reborn. The flood is humanity's oldest fear, and its oldest reset button. So when Plato told of Atlantis sinking beneath the sea, he wasn't inventing something new. He was adding a chapter to a story the world already knew by heart. And maybe that's why his version took root so deeply. It combined the flood's divine punishment with philosophy's human frailty. Atlantis wasn't just a city that drowned, it was a civilization that deserved to. But here's where things get fascinating. While theologians saw these flood stories as signs of divine wrath, modern scientists began to see something else: memory. Not myth, but cultural memory. Fragments of real geological disasters passed down through oral tradition. In the 20th century, geologists discovered evidence of massive floods and sea level changes across the globe. Around 10,000 years ago, roughly when Plato dated Atlantis's fall, the last ice age ended. Melting glaciers raised sea levels by more than 100 meters, drowning entire coastlines. Low-lying lands in what's now the North Sea, known as Doggerland, were swallowed by rising waters, taking with them human settlements. Ancient river valleys off India's coast and submerged temples in southern Japan hinted that whole worlds had once existed where the sea now ruled. Was Plato's Atlantis simply the echo of those drowned lands? A story retold so many times that the details blurred, leaving only the emotional truth that the sea gives and the sea takes away. It's possible. The timing fits eerily well. The world after the Ice Age was full of cataclysmic change. Earthquakes, floods, volcanoes, collapsing glaciers. To a Bronze Age observer, such destruction would have looked apocalyptic. Cities and coasts vanishing overnight, entire populations displaced. Those memories, passed down for generations, might have become the foundation for flood myths from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. But Plato's version added something the others didn't: morality. The gods didn't flood Atlantis because of chance or chaos. They flooded it because of arrogance. And that perhaps is why it survived when others faded. It gave the flood meaning. Even today, scientists and storytellers keep circling the same question: how much of myth is memory? How much of memory is metaphor? When marine archaeologists discovered the ruins of Pavlopatri, a Bronze Age city off the coast of Greece, perfectly preserved beneath the waves, it was like finding a small-scale Atlantis. Streets, courtyards, pottery, all still there 5,000 years later. It wasn't as grand or as moralized, but it proved one thing: cities really do sink. The sea really does erase. Other finds deepen the mystery. Off India's coast, sonar scans revealed submerged structures near Dwarka, a city tied to ancient Hindu legends. In Japan, divers found the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater formation that some claim shows steps, platforms, even carvings, though geologists still argue it's natural. Each new discovery teased the same thought: maybe myths don't lie, maybe they just exaggerate. And that's the paradox of Atlantis. It sits perfectly between what we can prove and what we can feel. Every culture's flood story tells of water reclaiming the world, of pride meeting consequence, of survival and rebirth. But Plato gave that story a face: a city with walls and canals, kings and laws, temples and treasure. He made it human. You can almost imagine him sitting there, centuries after the last ice age, looking out over Athens and wondering what had come before, what forgotten worlds lay beneath the sea. He wouldn't have had sonar or carbon dating, but he would have had imagination. Maybe he looked west at the horizon, at the restless shimmer of the Aegean, and thought, something's out there. And even if he invented it, he touched a truth deeper than geology, because the real question isn't whether Atlantis existed, but why we keep needing it to. The flood myth isn't about losing land. It's about losing certainty. It's the story of what happens when humans think they've mastered the world, and the world quietly reminds them that they haven't. It's about the limits of control, the humility of survival, the thin line between triumph and tragedy. Atlantis is every civilization's obituary written in advance. It's Rome before the barbarians, London before the Blitz, us before whatever comes next. And that's why it never dies. Every time a scientist finds a new ruin or a satellite maps a new ridge beneath the sea, we hold our breath, hoping that maybe this time we'll find proof. But maybe we already have. Maybe the proof isn't in coral or stone. It's in the fact that every culture, from the Nile to the Andes, remembers the same thing. The world ends in water, and it always will again. When you stand on a shore and watch the tide creep up your ankles, you can feel it, that slow, eternal heartbeat of the planet. The same rhythm that drowned Atlantis still hums beneath your feet. And for all our technology, for all our cities of glass and steel, we're not so different from those imagined Atlanteans, clever, proud, building on borrowed time. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Atlantis had slipped from Plato's philosophical realm into something much larger, a cultural obsession that crossed borders, languages, and eventually centuries. But it was in the modern age that the myth began to mutate into something even stranger. A vessel for every human theory about origins, lost wisdom, and the purpose of suffering itself. Enter the philosophers, writers, and dreamers of the Age of Reason, and the story takes on new meaning. Voltaire, ever the cynic, used the legend to mock blind optimism. If a perfect civilization like Atlantis could drown overnight, he asked, what hope was there for anyone? Others, like Leibniz and Kant, took the story as an intellectual challenge, a puzzle about nature and morality. But it was Voltaire's protégé, Rousseau, who saw the deeper human pattern. Civilizations rise and fall, not because of divine punishment, but because they forget the simplicity that made them great. Atlantis became his metaphor for humanity's fall from natural virtue into decadence. Then came the Enlightenment's literary rebels, and they turned the myth into weaponry. Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels mocked the scientific arrogance of his age, with floating islands and absurd academies of knowledge. Lord Byron and Percy Shelley imagined drowned kingdoms as symbols of rebellion against oppressive gods and monarchs. By the time Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, the Atlantis story had transformed into something almost existential, a parable about what happens when human ambition outpaces humility. Yet, the person who would give the legend its loudest new voice wasn't a philosopher or scientist. It was a French writer with a flair for wonder, Voltaire's literary descendant in spirit, Jules Verne. In 1870, Verne published 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and in one unforgettable chapter, Captain Nemo leads his guests through the ruins of a city deep beneath the ocean floor, arches, columns, and silent streets lit by ghostly light. Here, Nemo whispers, is Atlantis. Verne doesn't claim it's real. He doesn't have to. The power of the image, the silent city beneath crushing darkness, captured the imagination of an industrial world, suddenly obsessed with both progress and loss. The Victorians were tunneling, mining, laying cables under oceans. They were literally reaching into the deep for the first time. Nemo's Atlantis was a mirror, a civilization that had drowned under its own brilliance, now rediscovered by men who might be next. But then, in the early 20th century, the myth took another turn, this time toward the metaphysical. The Theosophists, led by Helena Blavatsky, claimed Atlantis was not just history, but prophecy. To her followers, it was the cradle of all wisdom, home to a race of enlightened beings whose knowledge seeded every later civilization. She wrote of root races and cycles of destruction, of cosmic laws and reincarnations. To Blavatsky, the sinking of Atlantis wasn't a tragedy, it was a lesson in spiritual evolution. Humanity, she said, was still trying to remember what the Atlanteans forgot, the unity between spirit and matter. Her ideas blended myth with mysticism. And before long, Atlantis had escaped philosophy entirely. It became a spiritual geography, a place that existed in higher vibration, accessible not by ships but by meditation. This interpretation exploded across the 20th century, feeding the New Age movement that still thrives today. For mystics, Atlantis was no longer a cautionary tale, but a lost paradise, a civilization destroyed not by sin but by the misuse of power. Then came Edgar Cayce, the American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet. Between 1924 and 1944, in hundreds of trance readings, he claimed that Atlantis had been real, a technologically advanced culture destroyed by its own misuse of energy crystals. He even predicted that parts of Atlantis would rise again near the Bahamas in 1968, or 1969. When divers later discovered the Bimini Road, a strange underwater rock formation near the Bahamas, Cayce's followers saw it as vindication. Science rolled its collective eyes, of course, but that didn't matter. Atlantis had become untouchable, an idea that transcended verification. Still, something important was happening beneath the surface of all this mysticism. The 20th century was the age of both creation and annihilation. Airplanes, skyscrapers, nuclear bombs. Humanity had split the atom and harnessed the stars, but it had also learned how to destroy itself in a single night. A phrase that sounded hauntingly like Plato's one day and one night of misfortune. No wonder the myth felt prophetic again. In the ashes of World War II, Atlantis became the story of every fallen empire. The bombed cities of Europe looked like drowned kingdoms. The Cold War made the planet feel fragile, one wrong move away from its own submersion. Writers like Aldous Huxley and George Orwell revisited the legend's core question: can progress survive morality? Atlantis once again became the parable for hubris. But something else shifted too. As science advanced, the ocean, the last true mystery on Earth, became a symbol of possibility rather than punishment. Oceanography revealed mountain ranges, canyons and trenches, deeper than Everest. Jacques Cousteau's documentaries brought these alien worlds to television screens, and suddenly, the deep sea wasn't hell, it was wonder. Atlantis moved from a warning to a dream again. By the late 20th century, films like Atlantis: The Lost Empire, books like The Deep, and TV shows like Stargate Atlantis had turned the myth into a sandbox for imagination. No longer about moral decay, Atlantis was a metaphor for exploration, the final frontier beneath the waves. But even in these modern retellings, Plato's heartbeat remains. The gleaming towers, the radiant light, the collapse, always the same rhythm, always the same message disguised beneath spectacle. When humanity mistakes power for wisdom, it drowns. And maybe that's why Atlantis has never needed proof to survive. It doesn't matter whether it's buried in the Atlantic, frozen under Antarctica, or hovering in another dimension. What matters is that it reminds us of something universal, that civilizations like tides rise and fall, that every empire, no matter how magnificent, carries within it the fault line of its own undoing. So the question isn't, was Atlantis real? The question is, when will ours sink? Because in every skyscraper's shadow, in every digital empire's glow, there's an echo of that same hubris, the belief that this time, our progress is permanent, that our technology, our reason, our wealth will protect us from the sea. But the ocean doesn't care. And as the tides climb higher each year, as the world warms and the waters rise, the myth begins to feel less like fantasy and more like forecast. The earth remembers, it always does. If the philosophers and poets gave Atlantis its voice, the scientists gave it its shadow, the half-real possibility that maybe, just maybe, Plato hadn't been entirely wrong. The 20th century's greatest oceanographers and geologists approached the mystery not with incense or mysticism, but with sonar, rock samples, and the hard patience of data. They didn't believe in crystal temples or Poseidon's wrath, but they did believe in lost lands, in coastlines that had shifted, and in the staggering power of the sea to rewrite the earth. The first step toward unraveling the myth came from something as mundane as telegraph cables. In the late 1800s, when engineers began laying lines across the Atlantic seabed, they discovered unexpected mountain ranges, plateaus, and deep valleys stretching like scars beneath the waves. Decades later, as sonar mapping advanced, scientists confirmed what they'd seen: a massive underwater ridge running from Iceland down toward the South Atlantic. To believers, this was the smoking gun, the spine of Atlantis itself. But geologists told a different story. This mid-Atlantic ridge wasn't the remnant of a drowned continent, It was a chain of volcanic mountains formed where tectonic plates meet and pull apart. The ocean floor was younger than the continents, not older. Land didn't sink there, it was being born. Still, even hard evidence couldn't drain the romance out of the theory. Every new scientific discovery, every rift, trench, and fossilized shoreline became another canvas for Atlantis. When sonar revealed the subabyssal plain, believers called it the Atlantis Plateau. When the Azores were found to sit atop volcanic seamounts, people whispered that they were Atlantis's surviving mountaintops. The more science mapped, the more myth adapted. And yet, amid all the speculation, one thing became clear. Large parts of the Earth had indeed drowned. During the last ice age, vast portions of the world's coastline stretched hundreds of miles farther than they do today. As glaciers melted, those lands were swallowed by rising seas. In the Indian Ocean, the ancient river valleys off the coast of India vanished. In the North Sea, an enormous region now called Doggerland, once home to forests and villages, disappeared beneath the waves. In the Black Sea, scientists discovered evidence of a sudden flooding event around 500–600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters surged through the Bosporus, drowning settlements overnight. To the archaeologists studying these cataclysms, Plato's story didn't sound so impossible anymore. A single night might have been poetic exaggeration, but a single generation, entire coastlines lost to floods? That, they knew, was geological fact. So perhaps the truth of Atlantis wasn't that it was unique, but that it was inevitable. Throughout human history, civilizations have been erased by the same indifferent rhythm. Tectonic shifts, tsunamis, droughts and quakes. The Thera eruption wiped out the Minoans. The Indus Valley dried into desert. Pompeii, buried in ash, was rediscovered as if time itself had blinked. The earth is not gentle with memory. And yet, we keep building as if it were. Even the scientists searching the seafloor seemed haunted by that irony. In the 1970s, during the golden age of deep ocean exploration, researchers aboard vessels like the Alvin and Trieste reached the ocean's most secret places, the ridges, vents, and canyons miles below. They found life thriving in boiling black water, bacteria living on sulfur instead of sunlight, entire ecosystems that rewrote biology. Atlantis wasn't there, of course, but something more humbling was proof that the world can begin anew in places where humans thought life impossible. Meanwhile, other scientists searched for traces of paleo coastlines, submerged stone structures, and ancient harbors. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar scans in the early 2000s revealed geometric patterns deep underwater, formations that looked, at first glance, like walls and pyramids. The discovery caused a brief media storm hailed as the Cuban Atlantis, but follow-up research suggested natural geology, not lost architecture. The ocean, as always, was a trickster. That's the frustrating beauty of it. The sea erases just enough to make imagination necessary. It leaves shadows but no substance. Ruins without context. Shapes that beg for story. In that space between knowledge and wonder, Atlantis continues to live. But scientists didn't just look for the city, they began to study the myth itself. Anthropologists realized that stories like Atlantis serve a cultural function. They preserve trauma. Floods, earthquakes, and collapses were too vast for ancient people to comprehend scientifically, so they wrapped them in morality and myth. The legend becomes a container for grief, an anginal fossil. Every civilization that told such stories was really saying the same thing. We survived something we can't explain. And if you think about it, that's exactly what Plato did. He took the whisper of catastrophe and turned it into philosophy. In a way, the scientists and the storytellers were never opposites. They were digging in the same direction, one with sonar, the other with memory. Both were trying to map what humanity had lost. By the turn of the 21st century, satellites could scan the entire ocean floor. And yet, strangely, the mystery only deepened. Beneath the Atlantic surface, vast scars hinted at lands long drowned. Off the coast of Spain, archaeologists found remnants of ancient harbors buried beneath mudflats, cities destroyed by tsunamis, that matched Plato's descriptions eerily well. One site, near Cadiz, was even nicknamed the Spanish Atlantis, and maybe that's the truth behind all the theories. Atlantis isn't one place, but many. It's a collage of every city the sea has ever claimed. Every vanished harbor, every earthquake, every flood that turned pride into ruin. Each generation rediscovers its own Atlantis. Plato said the island vanished, and the sea there is impassable and impenetrable, because of the shallows of mud. But maybe he was describing something else. Not the seabed, but the fog of forgetting. The way memory itself becomes muddy, impassable. In the end, the scientists and the mystics are chasing the same ghost. The possibility that we're not the first to think we've mastered the world. And deep down, we know how that story ends. The ocean is patient, it waits, it buries everything, then quietly builds again. It erases temples and towers, and then, centuries later, reveals them like secrets half whispered in the dark. Maybe one day when the sea recedes or the machines grow sharper, we'll find something unmistakable. A fragment of carved stone, a symbol no tide could make. But even if we don't, the legend has already served its purpose. It made us look downward and inward. It reminded us that beneath every continent lies another, beneath every certainty, an ocean. By the time the 21st century began, the myth of Atlantis had become something like the ocean itself, vast, unpredictable, and full of hidden currents. Every new discovery, every satellite image, every strange sonar reading reignited the debate. Scientists hunted for data, authors spun theories, and filmmakers kept the legend alive with dazzling underwater empires, shimmering in CGI. Yet, the more we searched, the more it became clear, Atlantis wasn't just a mystery of the sea, it was a mystery of us. The modern era brought new tools for old questions. Sonar scanners, deep-sea drones, and satellite imagery mapped nearly every inch of the ocean floor. In 2012, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration confirmed what skeptics had long said: there's no sign of a lost continent in the Atlantic. But even that statement did little to quell the fascination. No sign wasn't impossible, and so exploration continued. Because Atlantis wasn't a scientific necessity anymore, it had become psychological. You can almost picture it, a modern oceanographer, standing on a research vessel, surrounded by monitors and data, looking down at a glowing map of the seafloor. No golden cities, no marble towers, just ridges, trenches, and mud plains, stretching into forever. And yet, something in that quiet still whispers, maybe, even in a world of GPS and Google Earth, we still crave wonder, and Atlantis remains the purest form of it, an unanswered question at the edge of certainty. But let's step back for a moment. If Atlantis is not real, what does its persistence say about us? Why does every era, no matter how advanced, still return to a story first told by a philosopher 2,400 years ago? The answer might be simple. Atlantis fills the space between faith and fact. It's the perfect myth for a rational age, a story that flirts with plausibility just enough to survive in both worlds. Science can't quite prove it false. Religion doesn't need to prove it true. It lives in the grey area where imagination feels like evidence. And maybe that's the point. Because beneath all the speculation, all the pseudo-archaeology and sonar scans, Atlantis is ultimately about something universal. The longing for a lost perfection. The idea that once, somewhere, humanity got it right, a civilization wise, balanced and beautiful, until it wasn't. That image haunts us, not because it's ancient, but because it's cyclical. Every empire since has looked into that mirror and seen its own reflection. In the industrial age, Atlantis became the ghost of technology gone too far. In the nuclear age, it was the spectre of self-destruction. In our digital age, it's the symbol of information overload, of how knowledge without wisdom can drown us faster than water. So maybe we keep returning to Atlantis because we keep repeating Atlantis. The ocean, after all, isn't just a body of water. It's a metaphor for time, for the collective memory that swallows everything. Beneath its surface lie the ruins of forgotten coasts, but also the fragments of who we were, our arrogance, our brilliance, our fragile attempts at eternity. Modern thinkers began to understand this. Even if they didn't say it aloud, the myth stopped being a literal mystery and became a moral one. Environmental philosophers compared our modern world, overheated, overbuilt, addicted to consumption, to Atlantis before the fall. Cities rise, ice melts, seas swell, and we tell ourselves we're different, but Plato's warning still hums beneath it all. Civilizations that lose balance sink. And if that sounds dramatic, consider the headlines. Islands disappearing under rising oceans, coral reefs bleaching into bone, temperatures climbing, storms growing wilder. The sea that once carried our ships is now creeping into our streets. For the first time, the myth feels like prophecy again. Atlantis reborn as allegory for the Anthropocene, and maybe that's why it refuses to die. Not because we need to find it, but because we're living it. Every satellite photo of vanishing ice caps is a modern echo of the flood. Every city built too close to the coast is a small-scale Atlantis waiting for its tide. We've always imagined Atlantis as a tragedy, but maybe it's a cycle, a reminder that nature always wins the long game. The ocean doesn't rage or punish. It simply takes back what's borrowed. Yet for all the despair in that thought, there's something quietly hopeful too. The myth of Atlantis doesn't end with extinction, it ends with memory. Plato tells us the island vanished, yes, but its story survived. That's the human part. The refusal to forget. We lose cities, we lose empires, but we don't lose meaning. We keep diving back into the depths, searching for lessons buried beneath the waves. That's what keeps divers descending, what keeps scientists scanning the ocean floor. They know they won't find marble palaces or golden temples. What they're really looking for is connection to the long chain of humanity that's always feared the same things and dreamed the same dream. Maybe, in that sense, Atlantis is real, not in geography, but in psychology. It's the shape of human nostalgia, the architecture of loss. It's the place we all come from, metaphorically, the paradise before collapse, the memory before forgetting, and the search for it? That's just us doing what we've always done, trying to turn ruin into understanding. Picture for a moment the deep sea itself, black water pressing down on ruins no one will ever see. A beam of light cuts through the dark, scattering silt and silence. For a heartbeat, it illuminates something that might be a column, or might be a rock, and the diver's pulse quickens. That thrill, that whisper of maybe, is the reason the myth survives. It's not about proof, it's about possibility. Atlantis doesn't need to exist to matter. It only needs to remind us that nothing we build, no city, no empire, no civilization is unsinkable. And if that sounds somber, think of it this way. The myth has outlived every empire it was meant to warn. Athens is ruins. Rome is memory. Even our digital towers will fade. But the story Plato told in that quiet Athenian courtyard still drifts across the centuries like a tide that never turns back. So the next time you stand by the sea, listen closely. Beneath the crash of waves, beneath the hum of the wind, there's a rhythm older than history. The same rhythm that once swallowed an empire and whispered its name into eternity. Atlantis. Not lost, just waiting to be understood. By the early 2000s, the story of Atlantis had achieved something no other myth in human history had. It had outlived not just empires but explanations. Every generation that tried to solve it only added another layer. Philosophers made it moral. Explorers made it geographical. Scientists made it geological. Mystics made it celestial. And now, in the digital age, the internet had made it eternal. The same way oral storytellers once passed tales around a fire, now millions of people debated it across glowing screens. Videos promised new evidence every week. Satellite images of ocean ridges mistaken for walls, blurry sonar returns labeled as temples, and endless maps covered in red circles, each claiming, here it was. But even through the noise, something beautiful endured. People were still asking questions. Scroll through the comments of any video about Atlantis and you'll find the same wonder Plato inspired 2,400 years ago. What if it's true? What if we're next? What if we've been here before? Those questions are less about archaeology than they are about identity. We're not really trying to find a city. We're trying to find our place in time. Because deep down, the myth of Atlantis has always been about memory. What gets remembered, what gets forgotten, and how civilizations try to outlast their own mortality. In that sense, the ruins under the waves are just metaphors for us. Modern researchers studying how societies collapse, ecologists, economists, even data scientists often talk about the Atlantis pattern, a cycle of innovation, expansion, and overreach that ends in sudden collapse. Whether it's an ancient island, the Roman Empire, or a digital economy, the rhythm repeats. Abundance leads to arrogance. Arrogance leads to imbalance. Imbalance leads to downfall. Plato's words echo across millennia, because they weren't about marble, they were about math. The numbers never change. And in the background of all this, the earth keeps reminding us that nothing is permanent. The sea rises, The storms grow stronger. Every hurricane that floods a coastline feels like a small rehearsal of Plato's single day and night of misfortune. Every time a city drowns on the evening news, Venice underwater, New York in storm surge, Jakarta sinking inch by inch, it feels like déjà vu. The myth isn't prophecy anymore, it's pattern recognition. Yet even as the evidence mounts that we might be repeating Atlantis in slow motion, there's something stubbornly hopeful about humanity's response. We adapt. Just as the Athenians rebuilt after wars, just as Lisbon rose from ashes after its earthquake, we rebuild after every flood and fire. Our cities are taller, our technology smarter, our walls stronger, but the myth lingers like a whisper, reminding us that progress without humility is just hubris in new clothes. And maybe that's why the story refuses to die. Because Atlantis, in its truest form, isn't a place, it's a test. It asks one simple haunting question: can we learn without losing everything first? That question hangs in every scientific expedition, every climate summit, every philosophical debate about artificial intelligence or nuclear power. Plato's island may have sunk, but its moral seabed still supports every argument about human progress. We keep circling it, generation after generation, as if we can sense its outline beneath the surface of our own ambitions. Meanwhile, the search itself has become a kind of pilgrimage. The National Geographic Society, the BBC, and countless independent expeditions have sent ships and submersibles into the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, even the Caribbean, looking for traces of that lost empire. Each returns with the same result: no definitive ruins, no temples, no inscriptions, just sand, rock, coral, and mystery. And yet, no one ever says let's stop, because stopping would mean admitting the ocean has no more secrets. And humans aren't built for that. We're a species that thrives on wonder. We climb mountains not because they're practical, but because they exist. We send telescopes beyond the solar system to photograph galaxies we'll never reach. Atlantis is the ocean's version of that same drive, the unreachable place that keeps curiosity alive. So maybe the real discovery isn't under the waves at all. Maybe it's what the search reveals about us. It shows that even after millennia of progress, we still believe in mystery, that for all our satellites and science, we still crave stories that can't be solved by data alone. Atlantis, more than anything, proves that imagination is part of survival. It's what keeps us moving forward, even when history says we should have learned our lesson by now. And perhaps that's the quiet genius of Plato's tale. It's both warning and invitation. It tells us what happens when pride drowns wisdom, but it also dares us to keep diving metaphorically and literally into the unknown. Every expedition, every theory, every late-night conversation about the lost city is really an act of hope, disguised as curiosity. We keep asking where it was because, deep down, we want to believe that something magnificent once existed and could again. That longing doesn't make us foolish. It makes us human. Because the truth is, Atlantis isn't lost. It's alive every time someone sketches a map, writes a theory, or looks at the sea and feels that old ache in their chest. The one that whispers, something was here before us. And maybe that's enough. The myth doesn't need validation to matter. It only needs listeners. Plato's dialogue was never about discovery. It was about remembrance, and in that sense, every one of us who keeps the legend alive has already found what he was really describing, the part of humanity that refuses to stop imagining. So the next time you scroll past another headline claiming Atlantis found, don't roll your eyes too quickly. The truth might not be under the sea, but it's still there, humming in the space between curiosity and faith. It's the oldest song we know: build, rise, forget, fall, remember. And every time we tell it again, the water stirs just a little, as if something deep below is listening. You close your eyes and imagine it, the ocean before sunrise, still and endless. Somewhere beneath that surface a memory waits, not a city of gold or marble, but a story older than stone, older than language. The story of how humans learned, forgot, and learned again. Atlantis has drifted through your mind so many times by now, that it no longer feels like myth. It feels like something you've lived before in every empire, in every ruin, in every quiet rebuilding after the storm. And maybe that's because Atlantis at its heart was never about them. It was about us. Plato's story ends with silence, the island swallowed, the seas muddied, the memory blurred. But he left us something more important than ruins. It's perspective, the understanding that no civilization, no matter how radiant, stands forever. That power without virtue always collapses, whether under the weight of water, war, or time. And still, somehow, we keep building. You think of the world now, glass towers scraping the sky, electric cities glowing even at midnight, the deep hum of satellites circling above. Our technologies hum with the same pride as Atlantis's temples must have. Our oceans fill with heat and plastic, our atmosphere with the breath of a billion machines. And yet, we still tell ourselves what they did. This time, we've mastered it. You smile softly, because you know how the sea would answer. Atlantis is not a warning shouted from history. It's a whisper from the waterline. Gentle, rhythmic, patient. It says, I will wait. It has always waited. For the Sumerians who built on floodplains. For the Minoans who worshipped the sea that would drown them. For the Victorians who believed they'd conquered nature with machines. And for us, the children of the digital tide, swimming through data, convinced the current won't turn. But maybe, this time, we're listening. Maybe the myth has finally done its job. Because for all the hubris and destruction, there's still beauty in what we build. There's still compassion in how we remember. When archaeologists kneel beside an ancient pot or trace the outline of a sunken wall, they aren't chasing Atlantis out of greed. They're trying to understand how people loved, feared, and hoped before us. Every ruin they touch is a conversation across time. And so the myth doesn't end at the bottom of the sea. It ends in the human heart, the one thing even the ocean can't erode. Imagine for a moment that Atlantis was real. Imagine standing in its last dawn, the air thick with salt and thunder, the ground trembling as the sea pulls itself higher, unstoppable. You're watching temples fall, streets vanish, and all you can think, all anyone can think, is how did we not see it coming? The arrogance, the noise, the certainty that nothing could change. And then you blink, and the scene dissolves, replaced by skyscrapers and highways, new screens and rising tides, different world, same heartbeat. Maybe that's what makes Atlantis eternal. Every time humanity reaches too far, its shadow rises again. And yet, this isn't a sad ending. It never was. Plato didn't tell a story about destruction, he told one about remembrance. His Atlantis sank, yes, but he made sure it would never be forgotten. In that sense, he saved it. And by saving it, he saved us from forgetting what always lies beneath progress. Consequence. That's the quiet genius of the myth. It isn't there to scare us away from ambition. It's there to remind us to steer with conscience. The Atlanteans built wonders, but they forgot wisdom. We have the same choice, every day, to build with greed or gratitude, pride or humility. The sea doesn't judge. It just balances. And so, as you listen to the sound of waves, maybe from a distant beach, maybe just from your headphones as you drift towards sleep, you realize something gentle but profound. Atlantis was never lost. It became the tide itself. It became every civilization's dream and warning wrapped into one, ebbing and flowing through time. And that's why the legend still feels alive. It's because part of it is, every innovation, every collapse, every rediscovery is just the tide rising and falling again, humanity breathing through history. You picture the ocean one last time. Not violent, not tragic, just calm, the light of dawn slipping over its surface. Somewhere below, the last Atlantean stone rests in peace, blanketed by coral, touched by sunlight that filters down like memory. Fish swim through archways that were once halls of kings. The water hums softly, a lullaby for what once was, and for what will be again. The myth ends not with disaster, but with stillness. The world exhales, you breathe with it. Maybe Atlantis was never meant to be found. Maybe it was meant to be remembered, not as a map, but as a mirror. So the next time you walk beside the sea, feel the pulse beneath your feet, and remember, the water remembers too. It has seen it all before. And yet, here you are, still standing, still learning, still dreaming. The tide retreats, and for a moment, you see your reflection ripple across its surface. Small, fleeting, but alive. You smile, because in that reflection, Atlantis survives. The lost city isn't gone. It's waiting inside every civilization that dares to hope and every human heart that dares to remember. Now, Let the ocean close gently over the thought. The waves hush to whispers, the stars fade into morning light, and the myth, ancient, endless, patient, drifts quietly back beneath the surface. Sleep now. Atlantis will rise again, but only in dreams. Good night, sweet dreams.